Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Life as a House. So, recently, this is another one of those movies where ultimately a lot of people are going to question one, where to see this movie, because ultimately it's not an easy way and convenient way to do so. I would probably suggest people to probably find a movie app of sorts that ultimately will work for you. Ultimately, I think it seems that I still have the movie Playbox app, but it seems like when like kind of searching through that, it was kind of difficult to find. I was like, okay, what the f? More than likely, I would just tell people to kind of just stroll through a movie app or two to ultimately find this film because I find it rather enjoyable. Ultimately, there are movie pros and movie play boxes and other kind of just movie. You could try maybe TV Crush and stuff like that as well. If ultimately you want to see something for free. Going into this, I really love the dialogue in this movie. There's so many tender moments going on in this film, and there's such interesting dialogue. Really, this movie could almost be like put out as a play of sorts. Like it kind of breaks down to kind of breaks down like that, where you could easily just kind of have a like very small transitional places and stuff like that where people could go. But ultimately, this could be done as a play at some point. But so going in this film, we have Kevin Kline, which I thoroughly enjoy. Him ultimately him being in Dave and uh, any number of other projects that he was. I think in the movie Orange County, which ultimately had Jack Black in it. He played the narrator in that film. Uh, he ultimately had been in Wild Wild West. He's been in and Out, so on and so forth. We also have Jenna Malone, who plays Alyssa in this movie. That kind of almost plays a little bit of a love interest, maybe quite possibly in this film. I really like her. I really enjoy like what she brings to the table. Kind of seen other movies that she's been in, and reasonably like as far as like not just Hunger Games. I know she was in that movie, but I know she's been in a lot of other things, and I really enjoy her. Uh, Ultimately, yeah, we have Mary Steenburgen, who ultimately I know from Step Brothers and a number of other things. Like What About Bob? What an enjoyable film. But anyways, let's go on our way to just kind of talking about this film in a very cryptic like sense at first, and then ultimately we'll go into spoilers about this movie. So I just really enjoy this film, but also people could deem it to be either a fairly sad film or otherwise just a film where some people might quite possibly find Hayden Christensen characters kind of annoying at some points, because even I kind of could ultimately say that at some point too, because we have to where Hayden Christensen's character is kind of very emo-ish and very yelling. I hate you, just like he is in Star Wars. I hate you. You don't have the high ground, Anakin. Anyways, um, but yeah, I I just thoroughly enjoy, especially the moment where Alyssa and Sam's character just ultimately just share a shower together. I think that that's probably the best part of this movie is just ultimately to where Alyssa just jumps right in, and Sam is just like, "I'm getting out." Give me a towel kind of thing, because ultimately every single time he goes in the shower, ultimately there's somebody that is going to try to talk to him while he's in the shower. But like this is the only shower that he can be in, just because his father doesn't have a properly working shower, because ultimately he is tearing his house apart. So what is the meat and potatoes about this movie? So we ultimately have it to where Kevin Kline is ultimately a character called George, who is ultimately going to lose. He's going to lose. He's going to, at first, quite possibly lose his job, but even more so, he's going to lose. Uh, the seemingly ability to control his mortality is how I can kind of cryptically break this down. We have it to where George is kind of running against time to ultimately try and uh, do the one thing that he was always wanted to do, which is to rebuild a house. And while doing that, he wants to reconnect with his son that is basically just gone. Like he reasonably is just so disconnected to the point of him just consistently wanting to get high or consistently wanting to just be on a path of seemingly self destruction. And we ultimately have it to where George is trying to ultimately get Sam to come with him for the summer to help him build this house, as George is also just trying to talk to him to finally just kind of give him some, maybe, I wouldn't say words of wisdom, but maybe just something to like hang on to. And it seems that while Sam is going on this journey with his father, it seems that he also seemingly is really starting to connect to his neighbor, which is Alyssa. And if she was kind of looking at him before at school, like I think now that she can actually take an actual real legitimate good long look at Sam, ultimately it seems that Alyssa is realizing that there is maybe quite possibly uh like there's something about this guy that she needs to figure out. There's something about this guy that she needs to uh, like pull back the layers of uh, try to figure him out. He's so mysterious, and reasonably we have to her Alyssa, who ultimately is already with somebody called Josh. It seems that Alyssa has figured Josh out and is ultimately just looking and wanting to be with Sam just because reasonably it's like she I guess she wants the challenge. She wants the challenge. She's very curious, and I really like her character. I really enjoy it just because the kind of spontaneity of this character, or the just like if anything, she's probably the most intriguing character of this movie, with the exception of George and his stories. So I really enjoyed this film. I really liked it, and when looking at it, uh, there are also like I forgot to even mention Scott Bakula from Quantum Leap is actually in this film as well. But we get it to where more and more this community is starting to chip in to help George do this house, and because eventually they are finding out more and more things about George as we go along in this story. And I think the opening scene kind of really is just fairly interesting to just tell the level of point to where George is ultimately just saying, like, you know what, I just don't care anymore. Like, I just don't care. Like, hey, if my neighbors are gonna give me crap, then they're gonna give me crap. But fine. Like, I'll deal with it when it comes. But when looking at it, it's like life is short, and also life is a house, or life as a house, I should say. I can't even say the title right. Life as a house. But anyways, let's ultimately say that things are way too long, and let's make them short by going into spoiler time. Uh, reasonably, yeah. recently I can't recommend this movie enough. Recently, if it could be just the thought of just like, well, yeah, I'm like, I'm not gonna rent this movie. I'm gonna find it somewhere. Find it somewhere. It's a really enjoyable movie. Try to avoid renting it. Try to. It's a good film. It's a good film. It doesn't like to me. I thought it was so good that I'm like, you know what? Like, freaking rent the thing if you can. If that's what your last ditch effort is to do, like this is one movie that's worth renting compared to anything else. So at the end of the day, that's all I want to say. Let's go into spoil the time. Spoil the time. It's about that time I'm getting spoiled. This movie. So we have it to where ultimately we find that George is ultimately going out of his home to take a leak onto the side of the beach. And we have it to where seemingly his neighbor, who is Colleen, is ultimately upset because Alyssa ends up cracking open her window to see George taking a leak off to the side of his house. And so and ultimately Avatar Colleen goes to George and ultimately is telling him it's like, hey, could you stop taking a leak off to the side of your home? Like my daughter could see you. And George is like, are you serious right now? Like how far did you have to poke out of your window to see my wing? Like come on. Like we're all adults here. So, and ultimately, we had heard that evidently Colleen and George used to have some kind of like relationship, but it didn't quite pan out. So we have we have here that reasonably George uh, is a father, ultimately sharing custody of a son with Robin Kimball's character, and she ultimately is living with Sam, and ultimately she hates him. He listens to Sam's character ultimately listens to rock music. Ultimately, some parts of his hair is blue, and ultimately he's very emo-ish. He just listens to music, gets high, and tries to do uh, creative things. Let's just say to get himself off. So because ultimately he ends up yanking and janking in his closet, and he breaks his closet to where all his clothes fall out, and we have it to where Robin ends up walking in to see what had happened and notices that ultimately Sam uh, had been stimulating himself, let's just say, in a awkward way. So we have it to where Robin ends up having her kids just kind of like go out of the door and just kind of lock the door or close the door behind him. So George ends up going to work at a architect place. He ultimately builds homes. Ultimately, it seems that George is a little old fashioned, that recently he loves to actually build models, and it seems like the new thing is to ultimately build off of a computer. Like give people models off a computer because supposedly it's faster. So we have to where George is stubborn in his ways and just likes to be able to build actual models, and reasonably we have it to where his boss is ultimately going to have him come in and ultimately tell him, George, yeah, like you kind of just won't conform. You kind of just won't do the new way of things. And so ultimately, since you won't buckle at that, we're going to have to let you go. So George ultimately mentions, it's like, well, like, okay, you know what? I've always hated this job since the day I got here to the very end. And George's boss is like, well, great. then I feel happy that ultimately you're finally gonna get out of here and this and that. And so ultimately George ultimately asks like, well, I have hundreds upon hundreds of houses of little models and stuff that have been all around this place. Like, would it be possible if I could keep some of the models, like at least some of them, because they're mine? And we have it to where George's boss is like, well, no, well, actually, maybe you can kind of just keep one, but reasonably, it's like, no. So we have to where George ultimately takes seemingly a his models. He kind of finishes them. He finishes the model that he has left to do, and then ultimately he takes this big uh, like rod of sorts, or kind of just a big. It looks like a bat somewhat, and he just annihilates it. He annihilates every single model that's his. He takes it and smacks it all over where every single model is. He desecrates all of them, and then he keeps the one uh, that ultimately he did and likes, and so we have it to where his boss is scrambling to not have him destroy the one model that's his, and ultimately George demolishes the one that his boss is holding. So we have to where George takes the one and leaves, and we find out that eventually George goes out and he passes out in front of his building. So we ultimately have it to where he wakes up in the hospital, and we now have to confirm that George ultimately has cancer. Cancer that ultimately is going to take his life within the next 4 months. And so we ultimately have it to where George decides to, like, well, within these last 4 months, like, I'm going to build a house. Like, ultimately, I'm getting severance from this job, and ultimately, I'm going to just build a house. That's going to be the last thing I do. So we have it to where ultimately Sam is going to school and stuff like that, meeting some people, and we find out that Sam ultimately kind of does some shady things for money, ultimately for exchange for weed at some point. But recently, he just kind of does whatever he has to do to get money, even performing acts, uh, kind of uh, bedroom business acts, so that way ultimately he can just get like either paid or otherwise just get his drugs or whatever he wants, or just get money. Ultimately, it seems like word is going around that ultimately Sam's character does that in school, and so maybe that's kind of the interest that Alyssa has to her. Ultimately, she is just seeing that Sam is so mysterious compared to everybody else, and basically he's the only one at school that I think wears eye makeup and no one else does. He has a lot of piercings and stuff like that, so maybe that again is piquing Alyssa's interest. So we ultimately have it to where pushing on, we have it to where George ultimately is going to talk to Robin and saying that she uh, ultimately George is going to talk to Robin and mention that he needs Sam for the summer. And ultimately Robin mentions like, well, good, because ultimately I hate our son, and so ultimately have him. Go ahead. It seems that whenever Sam is away, we have it to where Robin and Peter, who is ultimately the new husband that ultimately has seemingly the two kids that ultimately he does not hug. Ultimately, we have Peter that is mentioning how nice and quiet it is now that Sam is not home. So we ultimately have it to where George wants Sam, of course, for the summer, and so he ultimately goes and tries to get him, but his door is locked. So we have it to where George ends up getting a ladder to get into Sam's window to try and get Sam to say, "Hey, you're coming for me. You're coming with me at my home for the summer." We ultimately have it to where George is packing up clothes for Sam, and we have it to where Sam is taking these clothes and shoving them out a window out to the pool. And so, because Sam is saying that it's like, well, I wanted to go to Tahoe with my friends for the summer, and George is like, no, that's not what you're doing. You're not going out. You're not going to go and get high, because justifiably that's what he would have done if he would have gone out there. So George is telling Sam that you need to go with me, like, and where you're going and you're going with me is ultimately going to have you without piercings, without eye makeup, without nothing. You're coming with me for the summer. I need you for the summer. You need to help me. So eventually, Sam goes with George to go to just demolish this house. At some point, we have George taking a chainsaw to the house, ultimately sledgehammering this house, and Sam is not really going and doing this job. He's just kind of he's not helping his father. He's ultimately just kind of sitting out in the sun. We ultimately have it to where George is ultimately making him put suntan lotion on, and Alyssa comes over, and George like is desperately asking Alyssa, "Could you just put suntan lotion on him? Could you just?" So we have it to where Alyssa is rubbing Sam down and ultimately like tickling him and whatever, but eventually she leaves to go with her friend, which is ultimately which is only Josh, and so we have it to where George ultimately is asking Sam, it's like she's beautiful, isn't she? And so Sam doesn't answer. So we have it to where ultimately Sam is complaining that he that there isn't a proper bathroom, that there isn't a proper toilet. And so ultimately, at some point, Sam wants to take a poop, but ultimately, George is in the same room with him, and he thinks that it's weird. So George ends up leaving the room so Sam could take a poop, and so we ultimately have it to where George is constructing his own little shower, and we have it to where the sheriff and or Scott Bakula uh, is coming to George to complain about some neighbor of his that ultimately is having problems. A neighbor that whines and complains and moans and groans, and so George ultimately is mentioning how the garage that ultimately George is now living in was meant to be a guest house. So like f that guy, and everything is up to code. So we have to where Sam is ultimately, instead of showering in this very creative shower, he's ultimately going over to his neighbors, which is Colleen's place, and we have a tour ultimately. Alyssa had mentioned that he could borrow their shower if he wanted. So ultimately, he goes over there to go into a shower. The first time we have a tour, Josh is ultimately mentioning about a job offer that ultimately means for Hayden's character to ultimately be forced into having intimacy with a man in a car. ultimately just get money. We have it to where Josh is telling Sam's character that it's like, well, just think of something else, just kind of be out of the place, just if anything, like you'll get your weed or you'll get your money. So we have it to where Sam goes along with this deal, and we have it to where they go on and do this act, and ultimately the cops end up driving by while they're performing this act, and we have it to where ultimately Sam runs off, and so does everybody. Just start peeling off, and we have it to where Sam is just kind of like, God, where has my life gone to? Like, what has happened to my life, kind of thing, that I've gone this far, and this is like the lowest of the low that I could possibly sink to, and so I think Sam kind of takes this moment to realize that like I need to be like something I'm not. Like going to his father and really asking him, it's like, how can I be something that I'm not? And George is like, well, like what do you think that you're not? And he's like, well, I think I'm nothing. Like I think I'm like I think I need to be like so we have it to where ultimately we find out that Josh had gotten arrested, and so ultimately, while uh, Sam is ultimately hearing about this information via Alyssa being next to him in the shower, basically she just walks in there and is like, you know what, like you're taking too long, so how about I just share a shower with you? And we have it to where Sam is like, "Oh my god!" Like she is basically just going on in, and he's like, yeah, could I have a towel, and can I like get out?" And so ultimately, she is going ahead and taking a shower while he is still in there, and she's like, "Well, you can leave if you want, but he can't." Um, and so ultimately, it seems like more than once they end up taking a shower with one another, and basically, Sam has to confess that like she's an attractive woman, and that ultimately, it's hard for him to look at her, and uh, also having to try and to uh, not jerk it within the place in which he lives now, which is basically a toilet that has a armoire around it. Because ultimately you have George who has to put his home up to code, and supposedly there is not a proper bathroom in the place where George is in. To ultimately he has to makeshift an armoire to be a bathroom, uh, and ultimately crack open and ultimately tear a window into the bathroom. So we have it to where George is taking apart this house more and more, uh, to the point of like some people are ultimately saying, "Oh, thank God somebody's destroying this house! Like, thank God it's an eyesore." And we have to where George is like, "Yeah, like it's great that like I think we're going to build a rehabilitation station here." Or, "Oh, I think that there's going to be like," because we have these people that are just like the higher on the high life of this town, and like this is just an eyesore to them. So like, yeah, I'm gonna make something even horrible over here. I'm gonna make something you're gonna regret having be built here. So we ultimately have it to where George is kind of opening up about his past. Really, we find out that George mentions that his father would go out of his way to make him so small, like that. Basically, he was always under his thumb, and to where ultimately anything that George uh, could possibly do wouldn't be good enough. To where like he's mentioning like his haircuts, how whenever George would cut his hair, ultimately, if his hair grew too long, he was a hippie. So ultimately, when George would cut it, um, he like his father would always have some like garbage thing to say to his son about whatever his haircut looked like. To ultimately, if he cut it to look like he had a buzz cut, then ultimately he would be uh, like a marine, or if he tried to shave his head, he'd look like a psycho, and like so we have it to where George ultimately just every single time that he tried to appease his father, nothing ever worked. Um, and then also we get to uh, another story where ultimately we have it toward George mentions that at some point he he brought a gun into his father while he was sleeping. Like basically, the gun wouldn't have done any real damage because it was just a BB gun, but it would have hurt really bad. But George just ultimately that's how just upset he was. And we find out that ultimately, Sam ultimately asks him, it's like, well, would you have ever really pulled the trigger? And George says, no, because I loved him too much. But ultimately, we find another story where George is talking about his mother and how basically his mother was walking around the house with sunglasses on, and nobody in the house said anything because ultimately everyone all knew that that their father had hit her, and so ultimately she just wore sunglasses in the house. So we ultimately have it to where there's some really fascinating stories here, and I really enjoy them. Even though it's hard to hear, but still it's like really fascinating. I think to just kind of go through this movie and just uh, like these really tender moments of these stories that are just kind of really just like really eye opening to you, really to invest in these characters, which I think is a beautiful piece. Um, we have it to where ultimately Alyssa is talking to Sam while in the shower, and we're gonna finish that shower scene up where recently Sam is ultimately mentioning again to Alyssa that it's like, well, you're really attractive, and this and that, and so ultimately we have it to where Alyssa ends up going and seemingly making out with Sam in the shower. To ultimately, I think she's also kind of feeling him up a little bit too. To ultimately, he ends up uh, giving himself some relief into the shower. To ultimately, we have it to Alyssa is saying, "Oh my God, you are going to have to scrub this shower," and so. But hey, it's not his fault. It's not his fault that she's hot. So, anyways, going into further in here. So we ultimately have it to where Alyssa is spending so much time with Sam, ultimately helping build their house, or ultimately just going with uh, Sam's character to ultimately uh, take his two younger brothers out to go to the arcade, and we ultimately have Josh, who is seemingly spending a little too much time with Alyssa's mother, and ultimately leads them into the bedroom. Um, so we ultimately Colleen could ultimately get a Colleening, if you know what I mean. Anyways, so uh, we ultimately head on to this moment where we have it to where George is ultimately like his back is hurting, and or what he would call his back, but are really just his body. We consistently see points in here where George has to just kind of lay down for a second, or he can't get back up, or ultimately he's just having a lot of problems. We ultimately see Robin, who is consistently there, ultimately talking about her problems with Peter, and but also like like she is starting to slowly but surely see a change in Sam, and ultimately they are they're reminding themselves about their past, ultimately to where Robin is just kind of reflecting on the time that they had spent at this home, and she had said that the best years of her being at this home were the first and the last. And ultimately, we have George, who ultimately is very confused of like, why the first and the last? It's like, well, the first because like it'll get confused, and I'll probably say this wrong. She says it's like, well, the first and the last were always just like the confusion of whether or not either one of them loved one another. So I guess that'll be an easy way of kind of not effing that line up. Um, but yeah, so ultimately we have it to where Robin is just kind of reflecting on the time that she had spent there, and ultimately how it's getting torn apart. And we have it to where eventually Robin is really and truly realizing how like disconnected just Peter really is to his sons, but ultimately just to her really. And to where recently Peter is ultimately mentioning like, well, hey, how about we just go on vacation? Like, how about we just leave? Like, I guess that'll just solve everything to just be in a new location and whatever. But ultimately, Robin is like, no, I need to be here. Like, I think I need to see Sam be a like. It seems like Sam is being a different person right now. It seems like we're getting closer, and so reasonably, like I need to see that happen. And so Peter is getting very distant because ultimately it's like, well, hey, like why couldn't you just like go with me to do this? So we have it to where ultimately Robin is spending almost every day there. At some points, we have it to where George is trying to find some things for the two sons to do and this and that, and so ultimately we have it to where like the house is trying to get built and stuff like that, and so we have it to where eventually we have the neighbor that is just like rubba rubba rubba. I need to be a douche, and so ultimately we have this guy that ultimately goes and complains way too often to where everything has to be completely 100% up to code, to the point of eventually filing a complaint that ultimately he doesn't want to hear one more thing of hammering, because when looking at it, um, George didn't get his house completely 100% uh, verified by every little tiny thing. And so, reasonably, his neighbor is going to come down on him for that, to ultimately they are not going to be able to do one more thing of hammering. So, but before that, we ultimately have it to where Robin is ultimately telling George that he or Robin is telling George that she kind of like that Peter had left, and because recently we have a tour, George kind of is really brutally honest with Robin. At some point, telling her that she's beautiful. At some points, kind of like looking at her, just kind of just looking at her and just being utterly amazed by them just being like together. We have to where George is mentioning, like especially when it was in the hospital, it was a beautiful moment where he mentions like I haven't been touched in such a long time, and ultimately he is touching some nurse, and then ultimately the nurse realizes how inappropriate that is, and she ends up leaving. Um, and we ultimately mentioned that George is mentioning like, well, I haven't been happy in 10 years, and Sam's like, you haven't been happy in 10 years. So we ultimately have it to where George is ultimately like actually being honest with Robin on like their relationship, on how maybe love really isn't quite enough, But then eventually it happens to where Robin is just like, well, but I love him anyways. Ultimately, we have it to where uh, Robin is to go to George while he's sleeping and wake him up, and just kind of ultimately tell him that that she loves him and this and that, and we have it to where George has to confess. It's like, well, it's not my back that is killing me, and to ultimately he is finally going to tell her the truth that ultimately he has cancer. So we have it to where Robin has to stay in to kind of deal with her quite possibly losing George, and George goes into uh, trying to build the house because he needs to do it. So we have it to where ultimately Sam is now talking to George, and he's like, you know what? Like, why are you taking all this medication? Like, what is up with your back? Like, if anything, this doesn't quite all make sense. And there is no all this medication can't be for your back. There's no justifiable reason for it. And we have it to where George is like, well, I have a problem with cancer, and it's not the kind that can easily be taken care of. And ultimately Sam is like, oh my god, you lied to me. You lied to me about being here. You lied to me about the reason why I needed to be here. Like, you wanted me here. Um, you wanted me here to basically watch you die. And ultimately, George was like, no, I wanted you here because I wanted you to love me. And so we have to where Sam ultimately walks off and goes into seeing Alyssa and just kind of sleeps in her bed. Because ultimately, what ends up happening is Josh ends up uh, Josh ends up going and working with these people, and we have it to where Sam is giving him a joke about 30 minutes and $300, and Alyssa's like, "What are you talking about?" And Sam's like, "It's a joke between us." So Josh ends up working on this house, and we find out that ultimately Colleen is calling Josh's phone because George answers. And ultimately, we have it to where Josh ends up getting injured, and Alyssa ends up finding out that Josh is sleeping with Colleen. And so ultimately, that's what easily ends that relationship if it wasn't already ended. So when ultimately Colleen is uncomfortable that Josh or that Sam's ultimately sleeping with Alyssa in her room, ultimately Alyssa goes like, "Well, I would have loved it if you hadn't slept with my boyfriend, or you hadn't slept with Josh," and this and that, and she had mentioned that also George would be happy if he wasn't dying, and so on and so forth. But the world isn't perfect, so we ultimately have it clean. After hearing this news about George, she went out of her way to find people to try and help this house, which was like, yeah, Colleen ultimately had some point been in a relationship with George that ultimately is like, well, you know what, I need to do something good for him, and so here's what this is, me just kind of helping him out. So everybody in this neighborhood at this point is just helping, ultimately helping George out, and so I just thought that this was really wonderful, and so we have it to where this neighbor is ultimately saying that he doesn't want to hear one more hammering, but we find out that Sam is otherwise tied to this character, this neighbor that is disgruntled. Like, hey, do you own a Lincoln? And ultimately, this guy's like, well, yeah, what does that mean? And he's like, yeah, I know you. I recognize you. If anything, is there a problem with 6 inches? Is 6 inches really a big problem to you? You there, neighbor? And we have it where the neighbor's like, oh my god, he was the kid that ultimately we did that deal with in the in the environment of which that ultimately was going to get everybody arrested. So ultimately, the neighbor is like, "Well, yeah, I'm just gonna go home and wait for my lawyer." And Sam's like, "Well, do we really need lawyers?" And ultimately, like, we have it to where the neighbor is like, "Well, hey, how about we just forget everything ever happened?" And Scott Bakula, which is the sheriff, he's like, "What the? What happened there? What? How did you just make him go away?" And and Sam's like, "Yeah, it's a small world after all, I guess," kind of thing. And so we happen to have them. We end up having them really putting together this house, and so at some point we also have this story that ultimately George delivers, where ultimately he tells about that at some point that there had been a car accident. A car. Oops. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Um. So I ultimately just wanted to finish this up. So we have it to where ultimately Sam goes and, or wait, backtrack. So we have it to where they're finishing up this house, but we have it to where ultimately George is feeling so ill, to the point to where that's when Sam has to ask him about medication he's taking, and so we ultimately have to where George is eventually trying to still build this house, but he just looks like his face just looks white as a ghost. So eventually we find it to where George is trying to struggle to get out of bed, and he falls over in his bed to where ultimately Robin goes to see him, and we ultimately have it to where Robin is trying to revive him, trying to wake him up, ultimately like kissing him on the face. And we have it to where George is mentioning, "Hey, stop licking me," because at some point we have this story where ultimately Robin had to lick Sam's character because ultimately antibiotics weren't working. So we ultimately have it to where George goes to the hospital because he is dying, and reasonably we have it uh, to where Hayden's character ultimately needs to show George that like, hey man, the house is all done, like we did it, and like um, before George goes, like wanting to basically show him through a window that, hey man, like the house is all lit up and it's all good to go for Christmas, because ultimately they were talking about putting house lights on, and or putting Christmas lights on, or like coming up with an adjustment for Christmas. And ultimately uh, George had mentioned, heck yeah, like definitely want to have this house all lit up for Christmas. And so ultimately they kind of lit up just to show him that ultimately it's like, hey, we're done. If anything, you can go, kind of thing, because we're done with this house, and that's the last thing that you ever wanted done is this house, which I thought was beautiful. So we ultimately have it to where George ultimately is eventually had talked about some video that had been the nice tender moment with him and Sam, and they were in the pool together, and ultimately George had kissed Sam on the head, and ultimately it was just a really fond memory of his. So we ultimately have it to where Robin is playing George that video, and talking what is going on. Because ultimately at this point we have like George, who is consistently like taking as much morphine as possible. Like his body is just kind of numb. So one last moment, we have it to where Alyssa goes in while George is sleeping before he ends up going to the hospital. And so Alyssa comes in and ultimately just kind of crawls on top of George, and ultimately is like, "Hey, can I do one thing?" And George is like, "Sure." And so Alyssa ends up kissing George, and and George is like, well, why? And Alyssa's like, well, like at some point that Alyssa saw Colleen kissing George, uh, she had she had always kind of wondered like what kissing George had felt like, and she had mentioned that it's like, well, uh, her kissing George was like her kissing Sam, and ultimately, once she had kissed George and got her curiosity fulfilled, she walked off. To ultimately, George was so happy because hearing that ultimately Alyssa had kissed George ultimately meant that it's like, well, hey, like maybe um, Sam is going to be a much more happier person, and hopefully him and Alyssa just work things out, kind of thing. So we have it to where ultimately uh, George ends up dying. And we have it to where Robin ultimately was there when it had happened, and ultimately she ultimately goes to Sam to ultimately hug him, and I would assess deliver the news. Like it seems like there is consistent times where they are hugging one another. Like we have to where George is hugging Robin and telling her sweet nothings, and so every time after that, every time someone is to hug somebody, I'm assuming that there is information being passed between one another to ultimately like be told something. So we have it to where Sam takes it upon himself to track down this woman because ultimately George had mentioned this story to Sam, and we happen to have it to where George ultimately is talking to Scott Bakula's character, the sheriff, to ultimately find someone, and this someone was the accident that had happened. So we have it to where Sam is going to give up this home to this wheelchaired lady because uh, Sam thought that that was the last thing that his father wanted to do. And Robin is ultimately like, well, are you sure you want to give away this house to this woman? Like, if anything, you could live there and, like, you can do that. And Sam was like, no. Clearly, this is the last thing that my father wanted to do. So I don't feel it's right to take this home. Like, I want to give this to this woman. And, like, that's how the movie just ends. And I'm like, there's so many sweet and tender moments going on in this movie, and I really enjoy it. And like for me, it's not all about like it's really all about family that is reconnecting, even to the point where even Sam kind of reconnecting with his family, and ultimately just kind of realizing like what good things he has in front of him, and ultimately just kind of realizing it's like, hey, this girl is actually interested in me. Wow, what a great life that I've led now. Now that I actually have a girl that is willing to just jump in a shower with me and give me kisses. Isn't that a great life? So, anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.